Nobody wants to comment on this painting.
No, I think it's just like, it could not be more obvious to me that this is not a Van Gogh painting.
It also looks like a bad restoration. That was my first thought.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from Artnet News. It's the end of February 2025, and we are here for our Roundup podcast, talking about some of the news of the month. Today, we're going to talk about the freeze week of art fairs in LA, which went ahead in the wake of the horrible fires that have mauled the city. We'll also talk about some updates on the disgraced art advisor Lisa Schiff, who's back in the news, and about the debate over whether a painting purchased for $50 at a Minnesota garage sale is actually a precious Vincent van Gogh painting worth millions and millions of dollars. We'll give our opinions. Here to talk is Kate Brown, Artnet's senior editor and co-host of The Art Angle, calling in as usual from Berlin. Hello, Kate.
Hello, Ben.
And Annie Armstrong, Artnet's wet paint columnist, who is currently in New York, but has only been here for a few hours. She just got off the plane from LA, and we've managed to wrangle her early in the morning to get this podcast out.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
How you feeling?
Great. I'm great. The week was action-packed, which I think a lot of people were not anticipating. It was a lot busier than I thought it was going to be, and I think I was one of many who were surprised by how many people turned out for it.
Well, we're going to talk about that in just a second, but before we do, just to get our mouths and minds warmed up, I do always like to start by talking about a little bit of art. Did you see anything in the way of art when you were there?
So much. I saw so much art. Yeah, I saw a ton of gallery shows. There was a lot of exciting stuff going down on gallery floors as well as the fairs. I think one of my highlights was Sam McInnes's show at David Kordansky, which I'd seen images of these paintings before, but seeing them in person really, really brought them to life to me. It's like a very funny and sinister show that's all celebrity portraiture. And it really comes to life when you see them in person. It's just this very judgmental gaze on a certain type of celebrity. It's great.
And you had reported, I believe, that Sam was going to be leaving JTT when they were closing in 2023 to go to David Kordansky. I was just jogging my memory about that because that was actually quite a while ago, and this is his first show.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it looked great. It seemed like a perfect fit. The passage of time.
Sinister celebrity. Portraits does seem, in a normal time, would be very LA, yes.
Yeah, there was plenty of that around. I kind of had a little roundup of it that I put on my Instagram of one of the big smash paintings on the fair floor at Frieze was Elizabeth Peyton's portrait of Beck, which I think sold for like $2 million, something like that. I need to check it, but it's a great painting.
Wow, well, that does almost seem, like the appeal to a certain kind of LA normal. Yeah, I will talk about that.
Yeah, we'll get there.
We'll get to LA. What about Berlin, Kate?
Yeah, no celebrity portraiture. The subject of a recent show that I saw was quantum mechanics, which I thought was really interesting and not something that I'm like naturally drawn to. But Laura Provoost had a huge show at the LAS Art Foundation, which is this private art foundation that does these massive museum-style shows that are often at the intersection of art and technology. And they take over these amazing locations. They've used Berghain before, this club in Berlin, for example.
Okay, well, that's very Berlin. That's very Berlin. Berghain portraiture.
Yeah, and so is Kraftwerk, which is where this one is, but I won't digress into like explaining what it is, but it's this former industrial space that also has clubs in it. So for this installation, she worked with quantum mechanics, which the TLDR is that they trained a diffusion AI model to understand quantum noise and generate imagery based on it. So it's this video work that is constantly changing and regenerating itself. It was really beautiful and chaotic and random. And it was sort of the first time where I felt like I understood the poetic appeal of quantum theory in a way. And it was nice to see these moments where you're like, oh yes, like art can help render science. I thought it was great. And definitely my takeaway was the sort of unpredictability of quantum theory mirrors creativity in really fascinating ways. So it was exciting to see.
Oh, that's terrific. What a delightful thing to see. That's very unusual. You know, anything on the art and science vibe that hits that well.
Mm-hmm. It's a tough one, yeah. What about you, Ben?
Oh, well, you know what? I did not intend this to be this way, but what I saw kind of fits as a perfect triad with Annie's present in LA, Kate's future in Berlin. And I went into the deep past. I went for a wander in Tribeca and wandered into Alluring Augustine Gallery. And they have this show called Treasures of the Medieval World. And I was just so delighted by it. It's a collaboration with British art specialist in this kind of art, Sam Fogg. And I guess it's the third in a series of shows they've done of medieval objects. And just to wander in, just on an average Saturday afternoon and suddenly be surrounded by these otherworldly pieces of the past, I was enchanted by it, you guys, genuinely. They have this illustrated manuscript there that is a tome of medieval warfare that's like held open to a page that has this illustration of these two armored knights working this gnarly contraption of war, this spiked wheeled vehicle. And my eyes were popping out of my head. I was so excited. And I just also thought, what a thing to be able to walk around a neighborhood in your city and just have such amazing stuff pop out at you. Because there was a lot of other good stuff other than that I happened into.
I like that medieval wartime seems like a fantastical escapism for you.
For sure. Medieval art is so hot right now, too. Like medievalism is trending on TikTok. So you're right.
Is it?
On trend.
Really?
I think so.
That's funny.
I've heard.
I do think there is something to that. Watch the site. There may be some article on neo-medievalism upcoming.
Castle Core.
Without further ado, I think let's return to the present and the ultra contemporary present and talk about LA, because this is, I guess, an update for folks listening on state of the art market, on big art industry event, which is the LA fairs, which have been gaining credibility, cachet, become a big part of the calendar for people. But obviously, there's a particular even debate about whether these fairs should go forward, right, Annie?
Yeah, there was. We're about a month out from when the fires happened in LA. They were deadly and thousands of people lost their homes. And that was around the time when gallerists were going to ship their art over to LA and felt obviously quite conflicted about doing so. It was kind of messy, like how it all came to be. Felix, the smaller satellite fair, kind of like led the charge in making sure that the fairs went on as planned, and Frieze itself followed suit a little bit later. So I think there was just general confusion about like who to look towards for guidance on this. I included in my coverage that people on the ground in LA were very aware that outsiders only saw true disaster and felt like we were going to touch down and just like be in like scorched earth. Everybody was wearing masks, poor air quality, all that kind of stuff. That's definitely how I felt. But then on the ground, it seemed like enough time had passed that people in Los Angeles just wanted to move forward and move on and kind of really needed the economic boon to do so. There's a lot of examples of how the fair happening was really, really good for some people who lost everything. But still, there was this kind of sneaking feeling the whole time. Somebody put it to me like this: if I was a music journalist and I was going to cover Coachella would not happen. It's a commercial art fair, so of course it's different. But like the hoopla surrounding it felt a little bit odd for interlopers. Like it just didn't feel totally sensitive to go and party while we were kind of celebrating people who just like had to cobble together a show like within the last 3 weeks because their entire studio burnt down.
Yeah, I was touch and go whether or not these fairs would even happen. I know there were big group LA art community Zoom calls where people were talking together about what should happen and so on. In the end, it seemed like most people were like, look, we need the business. And a lot of people rely on this as a industry event. It would be another blow not to do it. What was the controversy against? Was it just like it would be inappropriate to be partying, essentially, or to be engaging in like commerce when the rubble is still smoking?
There was this narrative the whole time I was there that, say the fires hadn't happened and Frieze LA, it was just a normal calendar Frieze LA, it would have been a watched fair because had it gone wrong for some galleries, we probably would have seen a lot more gallery closures. That's just usually the case for smaller galleries at this time. And I think that the communal effort to show up for LA and this emphasis on supporting the community got a lot more people out there and kind of like knocked that narrative off of its axis. It was such a net good, I think, for the LA community. But then the other fear is just, there are galleries from Europe that are going over to LA and like the the emphasis is not on supporting European galleries while LA is like really needing the cash infusion, and also New York.
Right. That's an interesting wrinkle.
Yeah, I was talking to someone when this whole debate about whether the fair should happen or not was going on. And that person said, like, well, the fairs are going to happen because if the fairs don't happen, the fairs lose 100% of their booth costs. And if they do happen, they at least get their booth costs. So they have like no incentive not to do it, really. And I do think that drives home the point that you said. I think it was a really important thing for the LA art scene, and everyone can see and agree with that. There were some truly heartwarming stories that came out of it, which I think we should talk about, like some of the artist shows from LA. I think that it is a very difficult time in the art market, and it was asking a lot of even New York galleries with New York artists that maybe just would have totally fallen to the background. Like you said in your piece, there was an optimistic spirit, but it did feel forced at times. If you could like dig into that a bit. Do you think that the optimism, forced or not forced, can also be sustained for LA? Like, what do you think the long-term outlook might be?
I mean, I hope so. I have a lot of affection for the art that's coming out of LA and a lot of the industry leaders there. But if we know anything about the art market in LA, is that it's turbulent. 5 years ago, we had that burst where it's like, LA's the spot now again. And that just cyclically happens every 5 to 10 years, it seems like.
People make fun of New Yorkers saying that.
Yeah. I don't see what would have to happen to make it sustain as like a global art capital. But that's not to say that so much really, really interesting conceptual art is coming out of it right now and artists live there, et cetera. I think that this was really positive for it. Like I said, like it recharted a narrative that was going to happen, but I'm not sure if this goodwill could extend much longer than this. And something I was thinking about when I was reporting too, and everybody that was there was just like, move forward. Like, let's just keep going, be optimistic. Like, don't think about it. Just be here, just do it. And it made me think that so many people talk about Miami and like what the future is for Miami, which is literally sinking. And like, I doubt this is going to be the first time that we are covering an art fair where there's a huge ecological disaster that happens before it, and we have to figure out whether to go forward or not. So I do kind of think that this is like an interesting moment to look at and example to set forward.
Certainly.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me sort of New York after Hurricane Sandy, although this is, I think, a lot worse, or New Orleans after Katrina. And it seems like, from what I read, and I have never been to the LA Art Fair, so you'll have to tell me if the vibe was different. To a certain extent, the Frieze Fair happens really near where one of the fires was, right?
Really close.
But these things are little islands and bubbles, so did it feel the same? Did it feel different?
Like, it all seemed the same. No matter what, Frieze LA, with all due respect, is never going to be a huge destination fair where there's like giant masterworks on the floor. That said, I think it just felt normal. Like, I don't think it felt like extraordinarily great, and it didn't feel bad.
Well, what Frieze is, or has been, is a place where there's a kind of a convergence of Hollywood and art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like you even talked about in one of your reports about the resurgence of conceptual art or something in LA, and that gets synthesized with deep bench of local celebrities and so on, who can convey a little bit of their glamour to art. And that does seem to me like an important energy.
Definitely. I talked a little bit about the new kid on the block, the Post Fair, which happened maybe 2 miles away from the Santa Monica airport where Frieze was. And that I thought was really interesting and a really positive force in LA, because I just think that people kind of forget that so much good conceptual art comes out of LA. The Ferris Gallery's from there, and like so many artists we love beyond just paintings of the ocean and flowers, they really do a lot of hard thinking out there.
I think also that the proliferation of these new fair models is something that is really interesting to see happening all over the place, including in LA. Like Chris Sharp, who started Post Fair, also did one in Paris in the fall called Place des Vosges. And, you know, I think like the stress of the fire is brought to the fore, as you said, like it's a stressful economic environment in good weather right now. And these fairs are really expensive for galleries, and they're financially ruinous for those who maybe don't have a lot of cash flow. And like Felix has become quite expensive, as I understand it too. So I just think it's great to see the communities rallying together at Frieze in the way that they did, but then also to see like that these alternative fair models are working, and that people are like, oh wait, we have a network. We can just do a thing together, and it works too at a small scale. Like I just think there's lots of moments of optimism that I saw from afar.
I kind of get to this in my column a little bit. I went to Post Fair with a local artist friend who kind of put it like, in LA, there's 2 types of galleries. It's the ones that are the commercial galleries that can, you know, boost your market. And then there's aura galleries, as she put it, which may not bring in a ton of revenue, but create a space that has allure for an artist and gets eyes on a different kind of suite of artists. That's sort of like the Rena Spallings, the Gogh, the Castle, smaller places that just have a different focus than what we really associate with LA, which I think is just kind of more facile, like celebrity portraiture maybe, but there's different energy there that's getting highlighted, and that's important.
Celebrity portraiture of the non-ironic kind,
yeah, right.
I guess. So just in a nutshell, the coverage seems to suggest there was a rallying together effect. There was a sense that people were there for LA, people love LA, and there was something called the Frieze Arts Alliance that came together. It's like museums across the country coming together saying we're going to buy artwork from these fairs to support LA. And can never tell with art fairs. Very rarely do people say at an art fair, it was terrible, it was ruinous.
Yeah, there's a lot of
you don't hear that till later, even more so right now. But it seems like people needed the good moment.
Yeah. I stayed through the weekend and I was still hanging out with art people, and that's when you can really tell how they feel. And people seem to feel pretty good through the weekend, so that's promising. Yeah.
They get honest by Sunday.
Yeah, once my column's filed, they really tell me.
I guess we should say there were genuinely artists who lost their homes, lost their studios, lost their archives, lost work that they had planned for that show, and got right back to work. Yeah. Making new bodies of work, sometimes responding to what had just happened, to be there for these fairs. That was a big feature of this. We had a number of stories on artists, spotlighting specific artists who were working in that vein.
Yeah, Kelly Akashi, she had a show at Listen, and it was her first show with Listen. That Zoom call that we talked about a little bit earlier, where it was like industry heads trying to decide whether the fair should go forward. She was a really prominent voice in that during that call and said, like, I need this to happen. I lost everything. I'm going to put together a show. Please let me put on a show. Please let people see it. And it came together. She had some, I think there were like maybe a few objects that she was able to like survive through the rubble. She put it together in 3 weeks, and it is like a tremendous show. I'm seriously not just saying that. It's really great. It's like some interesting sculpture.
She makes these poetic
they're really beautiful.
Sculptures, fragments, glass.
Yeah, it came together in a way that was like very inspiring to see. Like she'd been working on this show for a long time, and then it just was gone.
She pulled some bronze out of the fire, the flames of her house, and they're in the show, right? Like kind of changed from the fires.
So, yeah.
Oh, jeez.
Sarah Cascone also did an interview with Alec Egan, another artist who lost his home and studio. I think was also in the midst of planning a show at Annette Ekby. And the only painting that was not in the studio that didn't get burned was called The Wave. And so that became the name of the show. And then he made a bunch of other work that was sort of drawing on the fires. That's what I mean by sort of these heartwarming tales. I imagine, I don't know, Annie, but like, I guess they were also helping LA people process the fires too by going to those shows, the catharsis of seeing that.
Yeah, seeing that, there is a way to progress and move forward for somebody who has lost everything. I feel like there hasn't been a ton of reporting about this because I think people are just like dealing with insurance claims, but like so many collectors' homes were lost and so much artwork has been lost. It's just really, really, really wild to think about. I'm kind of hesitant to talk about it too definitively, who lost what. But yeah, that was definitely something that people were talking about.
Well, that's another thing about all this is it is really recent. I mean, just the speed of events combined with the need to constantly move on is, I think, brain-breaking, Yeah. And I'm sure people were feeling that there. It sounds like some of the stuff I read, it's like there's this very kind of manic sensibility where you have to put on a good face, but, you're still dealing with things. I just think that's one of the spirits of the time because, there's continuous cascade of bad news. But then, the economy has this imperative to keep going and to keep producing good news. So we're constantly being yanked one way or another. And it's just a very weird feeling.
Yeah, it was very uncanny. So yeah, I'll definitely be interested to see how the fair is next year.
Yeah. Speaking of always having to move on to the next thing, we do want to talk about some of the other news that people have been talking about. Probably some of the stuff people were talking about on the floor.
Yes, indeed.
At Frieze when they weren't talking about all this stuff. So Lisa Schiff, who we have a whole podcast on the case of Lisa Schiff from a couple years ago that's really excellent with Eileen Kinsella that people should go back and listen to, but she's back in the news. Kate, you were going to introduce this item, right?
Yeah, the New York Times published a profile on the art world fraudster Lisa Schiff, who we all know very well. I mean, over the years, she's been such a prominent voice in many news articles. And she's, of course, famously, like, quote unquote, helped Leonardo DiCaprio get a Basquiat. She had lots of high profile clients. She was a huge figure in the New York art world. And across the past year or so, this has all kind of collapsed. In 2023, she was caught admitting to not having 1.8 million that she owed a client. And then her whole kind of art advisory empire started to fall apart. And there's multiple lawsuits from many different clients, I think up to more than a dozen maybe, against her for 6.5 million in theft and fraud. So she pleaded guilty in October 2024 in federal court in Manhattan and is going to get her sentencing on March 19th. And she could face up to 20 years in prison. So this article coming out, this sort of like human profile and looking at the whole story of her was quite interesting. And I guess, Annie, this came out while you were in Freeze.
People were definitely talking about this story, and people were furthermore also talking about what they did and did not get at the quiet second auction of her artwork, which was...
Oh, yeah, that's a tip you got, right?
That is a tip I got that I've not yet reported, so breaking news. It was a platform called the Amelia Brothers hosted a Valentine's Day auction that's like, what is it called? The Art of Love?
I heart art,
yeah.
I heart art.
Inexplicably, I guess only because it was on Valentine's Day. But it featured a lot of work that was in Lisa Schiff's collection at varying price levels. I think there was no reserve on anything. So I was talking to a lot of people in the industry who were hoping to get a steal. And I think many of them did. There's like an Ed Ruscha drawing for $850. What else is there? Elaine Cameron Weir assemblage pieces that are kind of pretty cheap.
This sale, wasn't mentioned in the Times piece. Doesn't actually say it's her collection explicitly, but we know there is an order from the judge saying that her items will be sold off in two parts, one through Phillips for the high-value items, and then the decorative art items through Amelia Brothers, which is in Boonton, New Jersey, I think.
Yeah.
Man, if I was an artist whose work was getting dumped in this sale, I would be pissed. There was an Andrea Bowers in that, a neon called Climate Change is Real, that went for $9,500. But a lot of stuff went for just hundreds of bucks.
I think the joke that I heard over and over again was that there was a Darren Bader piece that went for, I think, $650. And it's literally just a certificate of authenticity that somebody bought. It's not even an artwork, but that's very Darren Bader-y.
Very, very Darren Bader.
I mean, I guess maybe because it's attached to her, it's got a good story.
Like, does that provenance work in your favor or against it?
I was trying to find, where it said on this sale that it was Lisa Schiff's items, and I couldn't, but the top item from it is actual painting. Some of this stuff was multiples or prints or photos, but this was an actual painting by Yukimasa Ida, Japanese painter, and it was called Lisa. It's an abstract painting, I'm guessing, of Lisa Schiff. It went for $28,000. And that is an artist that she worked with. As a matter of fact, she commissioned original art for him for a climate change fundraiser with Leonardo DiCaprio in 2017, along with Andrea Bowers and some other people. So if I were these artists, I would be really angry that the state of things was that their artwork was getting dumped.
And this sale versus Phillips, some of it doesn't seem super logical to me.
What did you think of the profile? Do you have opinion?
I don't know how to feel about the profile. I think that I can be such a sucker for narrative, and the narrative that it places is just that she is such a victim of her own design. She lost the plot, believed her own lies, has a ton of remorse. And I was kind of comparing the numbers between like what her damage was versus Inigo Philbrick, and I was like, it's like $80 million less dollars. And I think that just because she was somebody that I had met and who was very kind to me, I have some empathy for her. It just seems like it was like really getting lost, keeping up with the Joneses, but also I am gullible.
Yeah, she's quoted in the piece saying that she's the worst. It's hard to hear anyone say that about themselves, even if they are like being found guilty of so much theft. But she said, I'm the worst because I was so good. And I think that is exactly what you're saying too. And she was such a likable person. And I think that that's what really feels, it's such an about face. It really surprised so many people. Even some of the people who got defrauded by her, these are very like prudent art world figures. And that's important too,
She was, I guess, likable. I never met her, do not know her. But look, I was listening again to Eileen Kinsella's podcast for The Art Angle about this. And, her spending is a big part of the story. In the collectors who she worked with, her friends who she defrauded, very publicly, shortly after it all came out, were talking about how out of control her spending was, detailing the extreme luxury purchases that she put together. So to me, reading this carefully placed article in the lead up to her sentencing, to me, this read as like essentially her defense planting a narrative that she was really remorseful about having lived above her means. There's the line that everybody talks about from the New York Times profile is, I was miserable in that helicopter. I was miserable in the Wave. At the end, I thought I was going to have a stroke.
I was very taken by the new photos that were taken of her. She does kind of look like a weight has been lifted off her shoulders.
She's like playing with Lego in this little apartment.
She like goes to Blick and buys her pens.
Yeah. Her parents are paying for her apartment.
It painted a sad story.
Yeah. In that sense, it does work as a PR mechanism. And at the end, they start talking about the fact, she has a son and she's the only caregiver. So the stakes are out there.
Well, look, there are people out there crafting this narrative. Where Lisa's at and all that, I don't know. And certainly it must hurt to be selling off your treasures for pennies.
Something else I liked about the piece, though, I don't think this narrative is really talked about all that much in the art business trade, what a good advisor can do. I think advisors kind of get such a bad rap so often. And I really liked that paragraph that talked about like when she was a good advisor, this is what a good advisor can do for the industry, for their clients, for artists. I thought that was really interesting. And then, about how she completely kiboshed that. And I think the ire so many people have against her is that she has continued to make the art advisor role seem so shady and just purport this bad stigma against the business of being an art advisor.
She was never let into the Association of Professional Art Advisors because she was also dealing.
Yeah, she had been a dealer.
She was really good in some ways, but she was always a bit of an outlier, perhaps.
Which was also the case with Inigo. He was also a dealer. So I think that maybe that should just be illegal.
Maybe that's the red flag.
Something to look out for.
Well, speaking of red flags and dodgy dealings, I think we should move on to our final item. So another thing people have been tittering about all month, really, this has been a big story of February 2025, is this Van Gogh painting. It was discovered in 2016 at a garage sale in Minnetonka, Minnesota. It was supposedly purchased for somewhere in the region of $50. And then at the end of January, on January 31st, this New York-based data science company called LMI Group released a report that was hundreds of pages long claiming that this painting was an actually lost work by Vincent van Gogh. And I am actually going to share my screen with you because I think it's very important that we have an image of this in front of us. What do you guys think of this painting, which they're calling Elimar?
You go ahead, Annie.
No, you go ahead, please.
Nobody wants to comment on this painting.
No, I think it's just like, it could not be more obvious to me that this is not a Van Gogh painting.
It also looks like a bad restoration. That was my first thought. Like, that one where they tried to fix the face of Christ in some church in Italy and then it like looked kind of like a monkey? It was one of those.
Vincent van Gogh. That's what it looks like. It is very funny to go from the earnestness of this report by this company where they spend all this time talking about the spiritual journey Van Gogh was on and how he was inspired by other artworks when he was in the asylum to repaint them. And then this painting, to describe it, it is a man who looks like he might be cross-eyed or something with a fur hat.
The pipe is just like jutting out of his mouth in a way that I don't think Van Gogh would have done.
Yeah, and is that like a little beard, the little white puffy part?
It is,
chin,
because it's supposedly based on another work by a Danish artist. When you see it, you're like, oh yeah, that's almost certainly a copy after that work, where what that is more clearly a sort of a chin beard. In this, I don't know what it looks like. It looks like maybe a failed attempt to paint a cravat or something. It has nothing in terms of Van Gogh quality. It looks like, I don't know, a child made it.
Yeah, it's so funny to look at this painting and read this story with two minds. One being my art journalist mind, where I'm like, obviously this isn't Van Gogh, what a silly story. And then just like, if I saw that at a thrift store for $50, I'd be like, oh my gosh, amazing get.
Yeah, it's definitely a funky painting.
Yeah, I'd put that in my beach house bathroom, which doesn't exist.
Aside from just the general humor of this painting, people clowning on the painting, it became a story because the Van Gogh Museum, which is the authority, as anybody is a centralized authority on Van Gogh, pretty much immediately rejected this claim. And then LMI Group took great offense to that, and it became kind of a controversy, a war of words. The Van Gogh Museum had rejected it before, I understand. And the report details all kinds of things, why they think it might be a Van Gogh from this time period. There's some pigment analysis, including most of the pigments were from the end of the 19th century. The painting they're calling Elimar, and they speak of it in the report very much as if that's the established name. But they've just come up with that name because the word Elimar is in the bottom right corner. And so they construct an entire narrative about how it's a character in a Hans Christian Andersen story, and this Danish painter that Van Gogh may have seen may have had this painting, and that's probably connected. And all this is very funny because then almost immediately after the first reporting on it, a bunch of people came out and said, actually, it's probably more likely a painting by a painter named Henning Elimar, who is also a Danish painter from the 20th century, who's extremely obscure, whose paintings sell in the hundreds of dollars, as in
the three-figure range.
In the three-figure range, who signs his paintings Elimar. And some of the scholars we quoted in our reporting on it say, like, I made this discovery by Googling the words fisherman Elimar. So what do you think?
Oh my God. I mean, this fact, the second effect of this whole thing when this Elimar as another painter came out is just so crazy because painters sign the bottom right side of their canvases generally. Like that's usually where the last name of a painter goes. I actually looked at this report, which is 456 pages long, and it costs $30,000 to produce with multiple data scientists looking at it. And they have like over a dozen pages, like analyzing every single letter of Elimar.
What the slant is, yeah.
And like the brushstrokes and the slant and the depth and how like their Van Gogh's A in a letter that's on a table and another painting like looks like that A, although all A's, are similarly structured. It's just wild. And they do all of this work while it's kind of like, but could it have just been the last name of somebody else? Like
putting their
never
name
mentioned
where the name goes on a painting.
Where the name goes every time.
Such a swing and a miss. Nice try, LMI Group. That was really far-fetched.
What do I know? What do I know? It's like they've done all this scientific analysis. Like I say, I don't think anybody immediately looks in this and is like, oh, that's a lost Van Gogh masterpiece. I mean, if it was a new Van Gogh, it would be worth a lot of money just because it was Van Gogh. But you could imagine that the Van Gogh Museum might not want to authenticate it just because, like, this might bring down his rep as a genius just a little. It looks so childish. But what do I know? Artists have bad days, and artists experiment with different ways of doing things. There's no reason to say, I mean, this would be the same year as his painting of a very famous and very colorful painting of a postman from the same year. The thing is, the fact that they never in their hundreds-page long report address an obvious alternative theory about where it might have come from, in this case, a Danish artist, supposedly based on a painting by an obscure to me Danish artist. The fact that it might be by another Danish artist who has that same name and who does similarly sign their paintings in capital letters that, to me, look about as similar to this signature as any of the non-Elimar lettering that they dig up from Van Gogh. To me, that is a swing and a miss. You're going to need to try harder. And people are on their guard because of what happened, of course, with Salvator Mundi. There's the power of narrative. This story, painting found at a garage sale, becomes a big story. It's one of the things the art market is for people, is this magical lottery where you might find something and through cleverness or connoisseurship discover that it's an amazing treasure. But this same thing did happen with the Salvator Mundi by Leonardo da Vinci. It was bought for very cheap in a sale in New Orleans and then became the most expensive painting ever sold after it was restored. And then there are a lot of doubts now about that painting, and it's become just consumed by debate over this stuff.
Post-truth society.
Yeah. It's sort of the patron saint of the post-truth society, Salvatore Mundi, sure.
I like that.
I just think it also says something about the enduring relevance of like actual connoisseurs. I mean, you can throw data and like fancy science at something, but the human eye and like a knowledge of an artist's general qualities is still the most relevant and authoritative form of judgment at this point.
Who knows? Maybe we'll be proven wrong and, LMR will be the new...
It's like Rodrigo or something.
Coming to an auction house near you.
LMR will completely upend our understanding of Vincent van Gogh. Look for that in the future. Before we close out, I did want to include a personal note on one last piece of news from this month, which was the unexpected passing of the artist and art critic Walter Robinson. There have been a number of tributes to Walter, who was a character connecting a lot of different scenes and eras of New York art, and a painter who had a late career resurgence. Personally, I met Walter at Artnet magazine, an online publication on Artnet that was the forerunner of Artnet News. I worked for Walter there as associate editor from 2005 to 2010, when it was basically just the two of us. Online writing wasn't the center of attention then that it is now, but Walter managed to make Artnet a place that people talked about. He was my first boss and my first real editor, and the first person who I knew who thought about art as an industry and a social universe instead of an abstraction. Walter had strong opinions, and he liked writers who had distinct personalities. He was extremely hard on my writing until he wasn't. And then, for years, he gave me a lot of freedom to write the things I wanted to write. As a person, Walter was wry, combative, quick-witted, and big-hearted. As an editor, he drilled into me the value of clarity, sense of humor, and staking out a position. I still hear bits of his voice in mine when I write. He will be missed. Annie, thank you for calling in this morning. It's a pleasure to talk to you about all this.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was great to be here.
And Kate, great to talk to you as always.
Always happy to talk to you too, Ben.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also take a moment to rate and review us. It helps other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.